Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of the Replacement Level Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Phillips, and today I'm going to be joined by beat writer for the Milwaukee Brewers, Jack Stern. Rafal is not going to be able to make it tonight. He has a conflict, so I'm going to do sort of solo, but, I got Jack here with me, so we'll be in good shape here. We'll definitely be still talking about baseball. Brewers are coming off a very big and important win over the Cincinnati Reds today, so good news there. But first, Jack, how have you been?
I've been all right. We're in the heat of baseball season, so that's always a good thing. We got some big games for the Brewers that they've played over the last couple of weeks. A lot of games against the Reds, against a division rival, and they've done a nice job taking care of business in those games, so it's been a good time.
Yeah. And how crazy. The last time you were on here, we were talking about Brewers, and we're kind of talking a little bit more about the Pirates and them being in first place and not really talking about the Reds. And here we are months later. The Pirates are in last place, and now the Cincinnati Reds are competing with your Brewers for the division title. I mean, that is by far the craziest division in baseball this year and kind of like one of the craziest turnarounds I've seen in quite some time.
Yeah, and I think it really speaks to just kind of the importance of why you play 162 games a year. There's a lot that can change in a couple months, and in the case of the Pirates, they kind of tapered off a little bit. Meanwhile, the Reds called up a lot of this young talent that they've had in their minor league system, and that's really kind of invigorated this team, and now it's really looking like a two-horse race in the NL Central for first place. So it's been fun to watch these two teams go back and forth lately.
Yeah, and this is, I know, like I said at the beginning, this is a huge series here. I don't think the winner of the series is going to, be like the ultimate winner of the division, but it certainly, will go a long way in helping decide who the division winner is. But, just kind of talking about the Brewers, and obviously the trade deadline here is coming up in just a few days away, August 1st. Are you, really expecting any kind of big trade for the Milwaukee Brewers? Like, I don't think we're going to see Corbin Burns dealt away. I know you and I have kind of talked about that, but I mean, are they going to add, a pitcher, another bat? Like, what do you think kind of their best goal and best route, and who are some players that might be in line or make sense?
Yeah, so I think they're definitely going to be in the market for bats this year. I think that a lot of fans have kind of been wanting them to upgrade the offense a little more for several years now, but when you look at what they've done this year offensively compared to past seasons, it's just not even in the same realm of the production that they put up when they were contending the past couple years. So they really do need to add some bats to that lineup. I think that's going to be the top priority, and they're going to be in the market for quite a few guys. I know that there are a couple of guys out there who could kind of fit into that first base, DH, right field kind of rotation. Those are positions where the Brewers need some help. So could think like guys from the Rockies, CJ Cron at first base, Randall Grichuk as an outfield option, even someone like Teoscar Hernandez for Seattle if they decide that they're going to maybe sell off some pieces. A lot of it's going to come down again to kind of what certain teams on the bubble of this trade deadline decide to do, whether guys decide to buy or they decide to sell. There's a couple different teams that could really go either way at this point, but those are a couple guys who just right now look like pretty good fits for this team, guys who are more like rental players. They can provide a little bit of pop at positions where the Brewers just haven't gotten much at all offensively all season. They're probably going to be in the market for some relievers again. They are at pretty much every deadline. Every team could always use more help in their bullpen when you're trying to make a deep playoff run. Just having as many arms down there as you possibly can is always going to be really helpful. So I think those are two areas where we're really going to see the Brewers try to make a move. I'm not expecting any major trades. I know you talked about Corbin Burns, bringing him up again. He was told by general manager Matt Arnold that he's not going to get traded. The Brewers don't really plan on subtracting any major pieces from this year's team. If you were to ask me what is most likely to happen, I think what's probably going to happen is they're going to come away with probably one bat at the trade deadline who they can slot into kind of a power position and maybe a reliever or two. That's really what I'm expecting at this point.
Okay. And I think I saw a report that Brandon Woodruff is supposed to be returning here soon. So, I mean, if you look at that, he's been out for almost the entire season. But if you slot him back into the rotation, that's kind of the equivalent as going out and trading for another big arm. That's just going to add more frontline starting power for the rotation. So, yeah, it does make a lot of sense for them to go and add some more bullpen guys and, obviously add another bat. But are there any – I know Sal Frelick just got his call up, and he's kind of done pretty good, in a couple of games. He's only, 3 – this is like third game now up, I think it is.
Yeah, he's been up for about 4 or 5 games so far.
Oh,
So yeah.
okay. And he's handled himself well in there. Like, are there going to be any other notable call-ups for the Brewers?
So I think it is going to tie in a little bit to what they're able to bring in, or how many guys are going to be able to bring in at the trade deadline. I think that if you ask a lot of people in this Brewers organization, in the front office, on the management side, they're not very happy with the production that they've gotten out of this lineup so far. And I think that in one way or another, they are going to shake up this lineup pretty significantly by the time the trade deadline is finished. And it's really going to be a matter of, is it going to be through a couple trades? Are they going to be able to add more than one bat that really shakes up that lineup? If they don't, then you probably are going to see them dipping into their minor league system a little bit. Frelick was probably the first domino to fall in terms of just finding ways to add a little more production to this lineup. He really wasn't having a great season in AAA Nashville, but he got on a nice run the last week that he was in Nashville before that promotion, and it really just seemed like the Brewers are so desperate for offense right now that they were going to make a move as soon as Frelick really started to show any signs of productivity in AAA, and again, the fact that he's performed not up to his standards this year in the minors is not a knock on him at all, because he is still one of the best minor league bats in all of baseball, really. His hit tool is one of the best in the minor leagues, so that's something that the Brewers really needed in their lineup, and now he's up here. Hopefully he can help them out in that regard. He certainly has so far through the first few games of his career. But just some other guys in the minor leagues. They got Keston Hiura down there, who's having a nice season in AAA again, was outrighted off the roster in spring training. He could be a guy who they possibly decide to call up after the deadline. They've got a couple interesting prospects down there, too, still. They got Jackson Chourio in AA, who really didn't seem like a realistic option to make the big leagues this year, but he's really gone on a tear in the month of July in AA. Really looks like he's starting to adjust to that level of competition, so it's not completely out of the question at this point that we could see him down the stretch. Tyler Black is another guy who's really lit up AAA pitching this year. He's an infielder, plays a lot of third base, a little bit of second, too. Could even see him play some first at some point down the line. He could be another guy who maybe, if the cards break right and if the Brewers just can't add enough externally, they could call him up down the stretch just to provide a little boost for this offense. So they do have some guys in that system who could potentially, in the right scenario, make an impact down the stretch. It's really just going to depend on what they're able to add to this club externally via trade, and I think that that's really going to determine where they go from here. But one way or another, I do think that this is a lineup that is going to look much different in the second half than it did before the trade deadline.
Yeah, for sure. You did mention Keston Hiura there. If he does get the call up, because I know he's been up, he's been down. He really had a great rookie call up, and he hasn't been anywhere close to that level of production, since then. But if he does get the call up again, I kind of noticed on one of your tweets you mentioned how if he's called up, it's almost like it's the last plan that the Brewers have if they can't make any moves at the deadline to acquire some outside help. But if Hiura does come up, how's that going to impact the infield? Because I know he was initially a second baseman. They've shifted him to first, and so he can kind of play a little first and second. But you've got Bryce Terang that can play second there. You've got Andrew. I'm probably going to butcher his last name, Monasterio.
You got it. There you go.
Oh, awesome. Going to also play some middle infield, too. I mean, and then you got Adames over at short, so you kind of have a lot of guys that kind of all play in a very similar position, similar areas. So, what does that mean? Is Hiura coming up, and that means one of those guys is going down, or they'll just slot him in as the DH?
So if Hiura does come up, it's going to be at the expense of a DH bat. So Jesse Winker is probably a prime candidate to lose his roster spot if Hiura comes up. Or really, if the Brewers acquire any kind of DH power type bat, he's probably going to be the guy who loses that spot. Hiura is not really considered a realistic second base option anymore. He was never a good defender over there. There have been problems with the throwing arm, just his fundamentals at second base as well. He's okay at first base. He's done a nice job of kind of picking up the fundamentals of that position. So if you throw him out there, he can play a passable first base, so he could get some time there too. And in that scenario, maybe he takes the spot of someone like Rowdy Tellez, who's currently on the injured list, but he was the Brewers' starting first baseman for much of this season, but just has not produced at the level that they were hoping. He's on the injured list now, but when he comes back, if Hira comes up around a similar time, again, they could just give him his spot on that 40-man roster. So he's not going to take the spot of someone like Bryce Terang or Monasterio or any of these middle infield options. If anything, he's going to be getting at bats in that first base DH rotation if he does make it back to the team. So Winker, Tellez, even someone like Tyrone Taylor maybe who plays a little outfield because Hira can play a little bit of left field as well. Those are going to be the kind of guys who would probably lose their roster spot if Keston Hira does return to the big leagues for the Brewers down the stretch.
Okay. Now, Jack, we want to get a little more positive here. Second half, we're well underway in here. A couple weeks going from the All-Star break and everything. Brewers big series against the Reds, which we've talked about. But who, in your opinion, are you expecting to have like a really big second half?
So I think Corbin Burnes is a good candidate to have a big second half. This is a guy who, former Cy Young winner, made it to the All-Star game 3 times in his career. He's been one of the top pitchers in baseball for the better part of 2 to 3 years entering this season, but just did not perform at the level that he's capable of throughout the first half. Was much closer to basically a league average starting pitcher than one of the better starting pitchers in the game. But he has shown some signs in his last few starts of making a couple of tweaks to his pitch mix, specifically how he uses some of his secondary pitches, just likely in an effort to make him a little less predictable on the mound, and we've seen some pretty encouraging results from that. He had a start against the Reds last night, pitched really well on Tuesday night against Cincinnati, pitched even better against them the last time he faced them. He struck out 13 Reds when he pitched against them in Cincinnati earlier this month. That was the first double-digit strikeout game that he's had this year, the first one since September of last season, so he's just looked a lot more lately like the kind of guy that he's been in the past, and he very much still has that in him. The stuff has not gotten noticeably worse. Even the command is not noticeably worse by a long shot from where it's been in the past. I know that in his Cy Young season it was pretty much impeccable, but he can still succeed without having pinpoint command at all times. So this is a guy who still has really good stuff. Seems like he's kind of at a point where he's starting to make a couple of tweaks to the way he uses his pitches and even the shapes of his pitches. He's kind of toying around with a new slider too that's got a little more lateral movement than the one that he's used in past seasons. So when you have a guy like that who you know the ceiling is that high, you know the stuff is that good, and he's kind of starting to think a little more about his craft and find ways that he can get hitters off balance again, and we're starting to see some results from that, I think he's someone who could definitely have a big half for this team.
Okay. Well, I mean, they could definitely use it in their rotation. Obviously, teams get hot at the right time is a big thing that everyone's looking for and kind of wanting to have happen. So, definitely would be great for Burnes to take his craft up into another level as they wind down this season. I know, Jack, that you're a big stats guy. We talked about this last time. We're not around the halfway point, a little past the halfway point of the season. But do you have a crazy stat that you've seen on this season, whether it's a specific player or a team stat, or what do you got?
I mean, there are a couple of crazy ones. None of them are all that positive, depending on which angle you take. If you're talking about the Brewers specifically, you got someone like Tyrone Taylor, who's basically got about the same slash line as a pitcher. Even after homering today, he's got an OPS of about 450, which is pretty hard to believe at this point in the season. Someone like Jesse Winker is on pace for one of the worst offensive seasons as someone who's been almost exclusively a designated hitter, which is, again, not good company to be in. But really, if you look at this team as a whole, probably the most interesting or amazing, uncharacteristic stat, whatever you want to call it, is that by OPS plus, they are the second to worst offense in the National League, this Brewers team, and yet they're in first place in the NL Central. And I think that really just speaks to, on the one hand, a little bit of good luck and some good sequencing in there to be where they are. They're probably a little bit fortunate and haven't always played first place level baseball, so they've probably squeaked away with a couple of wins that they didn't quite earn, so to speak. But at the same time, it does kind of redirect you to what the strengths of this team are. They're a good pitching team, and they're a very, very good defensive team. By a couple of different metrics, they're one of the top defensive teams in all of baseball. They have the lowest batting average on balls in play as a pitching staff, which means they're turning batted balls into outs at a greater rate than any other team in baseball. So that's really how they've managed to stay afloat and stay on top of this division. They do not have a good lineup by any stretch of the imagination. It's, again, one of the worst in the National League. Only the Rockies are worse this year in the NL by that metric I just cited, OPS plus. But because the Brewers have done such a good job on the mound and in the field, that's how they've been able to stay in first place so far. And that's really what their identity as a team is. This is a team that's built on pitching and defense. They just really need to get that offense up to a level where it's just enough to reliably support that pitching and that defense. And that's what I think they're going to try to do in the second half here.
Awesome. Yeah, you talked about Jesse Winker. Do you want Colton Wong back? Would that be worth undoing that trade? Or
It's probably looking like a lose-lose for both teams at this point, because Winker and Colton Wong have both been some of the worst hitters in all of baseball this season. In the case of the Brewers, they might still come out ahead on this one just because they also acquired Abraham Toro in that deal, who's hit the ball pretty well in AAA over the last month. Was called up today, actually, got the start at first base, recorded a hit in today's game. So if he can end up giving them some value, the Brewers probably still come out on top of this one. But right now, it's just not looking like a great deal for either side. So
Yeah. I saw somewhere on Twitter someone talking about the Winker and Wong trade, and they're saying, like, I guess going into it last year, like, Wong was terrible, and yet he was like the worst player. They might have cited a specific like statistical category, I forget, but basically they said the Brewers still won the trade because Wong is worse than Winker. So even though Winker's bad, it was like a marginal step up just because you got rid of the worst one and got like the second worst. So, I was like, oh, that's so disappointing, but it sounds right on par for the Seattle Mariners this season for sure. All right. So we talked a lot about the division. We talked about how the Brewers are in first place. Well, competing for first place. Are they in after today's win? Are they back in first now?
They are in first place.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. That's what I thought.
But by a game and a half. So.
Oh, okay. I thought it was a little closer, but perfect. So we're concerned about this NL Central. Obviously, this division's kind of been crazy all season long. Is there a team that scares you as we, come closer to the end of this year here for the division title for the Brewers, or is it, it's the Brewers and I'm not really worried about the rest of the division because it's been so crazy?
So again, it's going to kind of come down to what happens at the trade deadline, because this Reds team that the Brewers are competing with for first place, they don't really scare me a lot right now, simply because they just don't have the kind of pitching you need to, I think, seriously compete for a division title and then make a deep playoff run. They just have really struggled on the mound. They definitely have some legitimate young talent in that lineup. That's a deep lineup now that they've called up some of their top prospects, and the Brewers have done a very nice job of quieting that deep lineup over these last two series that they've played against Cincinnati. But at the same time, I got this feeling that I can't shake that the Reds are very optimistic about this young talent they have. They feel like their window is open now. And for that reason, I just can't shake this feeling that they're going to go out and make some pretty major moves at this trade deadline and be pretty aggressive with bringing in some top-tier talent to really bolster this pitching staff and even add a little more length to that lineup, because you can never have too much depth. So if the Reds do make a couple of big splashes at the deadline, then I definitely think that they're a legitimate threat for this Brewers team, and then it's really going to be a tough race for that top spot in the division. If they don't make some of those big moves, then I'm not quite as worried, and I think it's a much easier path for the Brewers to a division title. So we'll see what happens over the next week here. That'll have a big impact on it.
Okay. Now, I want to ask you about another team in the NL Central. This past weekend, a buddy of mine asked me to go up to Chicago with them. It was the Cubs-Cardinals series up there, which was great. And in my opinion, it's like the best rivalry in all of baseball. But I know the Cubs have kind of been on a little bit of roll. I believe after they lost their Thursday, the series opener to St. Louis, they've now, I think, won 4 straight here. There's been a lot of talk with the Cubs potentially being sellers at the deadline. But as I was talking to my friend about, like, if they continue to win more games and more series and stuff like that, maybe they end up being buyers. Are they too far back in the standings that you're not worried about them, or could they be a concern because they do have a little bit more veteran players on their roster, especially guys who've been in deep playoff runs like Cody Bellinger in one World Series that could kind of help guide this team and, kind of not like cohesive, but kind of like bring everybody about like this is how it's done if we want to go where we want to go, kind of a thing.
Yeah, I think again it's a situation where if the Cubs do decide to buy, they definitely have some pieces that would make them a threat. And I think it's worth noting that they're the only team in the NL Central right now that has a positive run differential. So they're the only team in the division that has scored more runs than they have given up. So they've outperformed their opponents just in a pure sense that in that category, just scoring more than they've given up, which typically bodes well for long-term success, unlike all these other teams in the division that have kind of snuck by with negative run differentials, which makes you wonder how sustainable some of their performances. Right now, I still feel like the Cubs are just going to end up leaning towards selling and giving away a couple pieces, which is why in that scenario, I don't really think that they're going to be a huge threat for the division. But again, if they do decide to buy, that does change the outlook of this NL Central a little bit. So we'll have to see what they decide to do over these next couple weeks here, because it is a big decision. Because right now you could make a pretty even argument on both sides whether you want to buy or want to sell. So it'll be interesting to see which route the Cubs decide to take, because like you said, they do have some pretty good pieces on that team. You talked about Bellinger. He's probably a guy who is going to take a little bit of a step back as the year wears on, because I know it looks like he's having a huge bounce back here, but some of the metrics underneath what he's doing don't make it look like it's all that sustainable. He's just not quite making enough loud contact for me to buy into it. But they do have a guy like Marcus Stroman at the top of that rotation. Edbert Alzolay has done a nice job since kind of moving into that closer's role for Chicago, stabilizing that bullpen. So they definitely have some pieces. You talk about Dansby Swanson, Nico Horner in the middle infield, Power Bat and Patrick Wisdom, even if he's not the most consistent kind of guy out there with all the strikeouts. But
Yeah.
they have some pieces, so it'll depend on which direction they decide to go here.
Okay. One more talking Cubs and Brewers here. If the Cubs decided to sell, would there be any probability that the Brewers might be interested? I know it'd be an interdivision trade, which are very hard to come by because those teams end up facing those guys. But, we're winding down to the end of the year here. There may not be, and I haven't looked at the schedule to see if the Brewers and Cubs play any more this year, but there may not be a whole lot left. And if the Cubs are selling, could there be an opportunity for some buying there, especially if guys are going to be at the end of the year, be free agents and stuff like that, where Cubs are like, okay, we got something from them, but it helps the Brewers now, it helps us like longer term kind of thing? Or do you think it would just be a situation where we're division rivals, you want this guy, normally it costs you X amount, but because we're in the same division, it's going to cost you more?
Yeah, I think it's unlikely just because you have the combination. First of all, the interdivisional rivalry, but also just the fact that there are going to be a lot of teams calling on some of these players, especially guys like Bellinger and Stroman, guys of that stature. So it just doesn't seem very likely that a trade would come together between these two teams. So again, I think if you're a smart team of any caliber, you're going to be making calls on all of these guys who are available. So I'm sure the Brewers are going to be calling the Cubs just to feel out and see what the asking price is for some of these players, because a good front office is going to do diligence on any available options that are out there, but I don't think it's especially realistic for any kind of deal like that to come together.
Okay. All right. Well, Jack, thank you again for coming on and everything. We always love having you. It's wonderful to hear the latest insights on the Brewers and everything. But what are you working on? What can fans expect to see from you in the upcoming days and weeks?
So we're going to have a lot of trade deadline coverage over at Brew Crew Ball as we kind of get into the heat of things here. Whatever moves the Brewers do decide to make, I'm probably going to have a little bit of a longer breakdown piece, kind of breaking down all these trades, and then just kind of recapping all the action from this coming week here, this coming trade deadline. So we do have a little bit of our prospect coverage still going on from the draft, because the Brewers have wrapped up kind of all their signings from the draft and kind of reshuffling the rankings in this farm system, kind of giving guys an overview of who the top prospects are now in this Milwaukee system now that they've added a little more talent. So those are really the two big ones as we move forward here and get into the month of August.
Nice. And speaking of the draft, what are your thoughts on the Brewers draft? Was it a good one, bad one, or like whatever?
So I thought they did a very good job, actually. I wasn't a huge fan of their first round pick. They picked Brock Wilken, who's a third baseman with really big power, but a lot of swing and miss in that profile. And that's the kind of player that the Brewers have not done a great job developing. But they did a really good job snagging some high upside picks, snagging some high floor picks too. They were able to draft Cooper Pratt in the 6th round. He's a shortstop, and the consensus going into the draft was they were not going to be able to sign him because he had a college commitment, but they were able to sign him because they saved some money on some of their other picks. So he's going to be part of the organization now. There's a lot of comps between him and Gunnar Henderson of the Orioles, just a guy who's a really, really well-rounded player, does a good job in just about every facet of the game, 5-tool player, if you will. So just adding guys like that and adding some high-octane arms to this pitching development system, guys who have really good stuff. Just a really well-done draft for the Brewers overall, in my opinion. They added some really good talent and some guys who they should definitely be able to have some success in developing in the next few years.
Excellent, excellent. All right, one final question here for you, Jack. Trade deadline, dream scenario. Who are the Brewers, if you're the GM, dream scenario, who are the Brewers trading out and who are they bringing in to get them over the hump and make them the #1 World Series contender for this season?
So I think that one guy I'd actually like to see him bring in, this is not really going to fit the first base DH right field needs that I talked about before, but Ryan McMahon is a guy I've had my eye on for a while from Colorado. So I actually think in a perfect scenario, you could try to throw some kind of package deal together with Colorado where you could maybe get him and throw Crone or Grichuk or someone else in there as well. Maybe part with perhaps one of your outfield prospects who you have kind of in that system, not someone who's as high up as Chourio, but someone who's kind of a little more in the middle of those rankings, or maybe even one of your infield prospects like Freddie Zamora or guys of that nature. Jay Savina is another guy who I could see the Brewers kind of trying to trade for a rental type player and maybe use him as part of a package. So ideally they can add some impact players who can help them down the stretch this year. Maybe not all-star caliber players, but guys who can just add a little more depth to this lineup without having to part with your very top talent who's supposed to kind of form this core for the Brewers long term. And I think that's going to be the kind of approach that they're trying to take into this deadline.
Perfect. Wonderful. Well, that'd be great to see him get out of Colorado, actually get to play some winning baseball for Mr. Ryan McMahon. But again, Jack, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate you. We definitely want to have you back on in the future and everything because it's always fun to chat Milwaukee Brewers baseball with you here. But for all fans out there, check us out. Check out Jack's work. You can find him on Twitter. I believe at Jack Stern. Is that right?
At by Jack Stern. Jack Stern. At BY Jack Stern. Yep.
That's right. Oh, and it's not Twitter anymore. It's X. I don't know if you are comfortable.
Big rebrand. I saw that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I'm still getting used to it being X and not Twitter. But follow him at by Jack Stern on X. You can follow us at the Replacement Level 1 podcast, and then also check us out on Spotify, Applecast, and YouTube. But again, thank you, Jack, so much for being on the show today. And guys, we will see you all next week.